Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into the really intense final years of the Pacific War for Japan.
Right. We'll be looking at how things shifted so dramatically, from those early successes to the eventual conclusion.
And understanding this is, well, it's pretty crucial for getting a handle on modern Japan, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Japan you see today, so much of its economic and cultural fabric is tied to what happened back then, especially the immense pressures of the war.
Okay, so let's trace that shift. It often starts, for many people, with Pearl Harbor, December 1941. A huge opening move for Japan.
It was. And initially, the Japanese military had, well, considerable success across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But that attack, it really unified the U.S.
Instantly, right. Brought them into the war with everything they had.
Exactly. And we also have to remember the terrible impact on Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Over 100,000 people forced into internment camps.
Just because of their heritage. It's a really difficult part of the story.
It is. And yet you also had the Nisei, second-generation citizens, volunteering for the U.S. military, trying to prove their loyalty under, incredibly tough circumstances.
Such a complex situation. Okay, so Japan had the initial momentum, but then things started to swing. The Battle of Midway, June 42. That often comes up as the turning point.
Yeah, it's seen that way for good reason. U.S. naval intelligence had broken Japanese codes. They knew the attack was coming.
So they could set an ambush.
Pretty much. It was a devastating loss for the Japanese Navy, crippled their carrier strength, their ability to project power offensively across the Pacific. That was a major blow.
So that really blunted their spearhead. And then the Allies started pushing back, Guadalcanal, places like that.
Right. The counteroffensive began, long, hard-fought battles. Guadalcanal was won. Then fast forward a bit, the fall of Saipan in July 1944, that was significant.
Well, they're just losing an island, right?
Oh, definitely. Saipan was a key base in the South Pacific. Losing it wasn't just a military setback. It had major political repercussions back in Japan.
Yes.
Well, it led directly to the resignation of the Tojo cabinet. They'd been leading the war effort from the start.
So a big shakeup. Did that change the direction of the war? Did the new government look for peace?
Not really, no. The Koiso Kuniaki cabinet took over, but the war just continued. There wasn't an immediate shift towards ending the conflict.
Which brings us to the home front. The strain must have been just immense by this point.
Unbelievable. The government and military were pouring everything, absolutely everything, into the war effort. But the industrial capacity, it just wasn't comparable to the U.S.
You have the figures, right? Like for steel?
Yeah, I mean, just as one example, in 1944, the U.S. produced something like 10 times more steel than Japan. A huge imbalance. Fundamentally, they couldn't keep up materially.
And with so many young men fighting, what about labor back home?
Critical shortages. That's where you see these really drastic measures. Student labor mobilization, the Gakudo Kinro doing, kids from middle school upwards working in factories.
And not just students.
No, conscription was expanded. Middle-aged men, older men. And crucially, forced mobilization. People from Korea, from occupied China, brought to Japan to work, often under terrible conditions.
A really grim picture of total war mobilization. And conscription itself was extended beyond mainland Japan.
Yes, to Korea and Taiwan as well. People from those colonies were forced into the Japanese military. And back in Japan, everyday life got incredibly hard. Shortages of everything, food, daily necessities. It was severe.
So the military situation is worsening. Life at home is getting tougher. How did that affect public support, which must have been high initially?
It was, fueled by nationalism and early victories. But yeah, as the tide turned and the hardships bit deeper, morale definitely started to decline. Slowly, perhaps, but noticeably.
Even with the propaganda still going strong.
Oh, yeah. The government, the media, they kept pushing the messages of, sacrifice for the nation, certain victory, but the reality was different.
And they kept mobilizing more people. I remember reading about students.
Right. In 1943, they suspended draft exemptions for humanities and social science university students. The Gakudo Shitsujin. Thousands of students pulled out of their studies and sent straight into the military.
And even younger children were affected, weren't they, with evacuations?
Yes, the Gakudo Sokai. Started in the summer of '44. As U.S. air raids started hitting the mainland more often, they evacuated school children from the big cities to the countryside.
Separated from their families.
Often, yes. They were housed in inns, temples. We actually have a photo showing elementary kids in Fukushima having lessons in an inn they'd been moved to. It's quite poignant.
A stark contrast, isn't it? The official story versus the reality people were living, which leads us into that final, really devastating phase, the path to defeat.
Exactly. And the Allies had already laid out their terms, to some extent. Back in November 43, you had the Cairo Declaration. US, UK, China saying they'd fight on, and Japan would lose its colonies.
And then the bombing started to ramp up on Japan itself.
Dramatically. From late 1944, the U.S. air raids intensified, not just military targets anymore.
Culminating in things like the Tokyo firebombing in March 45.
Yeah.
The destruction sounds unimaginable.
It was catastrophic. Nighttime raids, firebombing, huge parts of Tokyo just incinerated. Massive loss of life.
And then Okinawa, that same month, March 45.
The Battle of Okinawa began then, an incredibly fierce, long battle. What was particularly tragic there was the huge number of civilian casualties. Civilians caught up, forced into the fighting.
How many people were we talking about?
Estimates are around 200,000 Japanese deaths in total on Okinawa, and maybe half of those, about 100,000, were civilians. The island eventually fell to the U.S. in June.
Meanwhile, the war in Europe was ending. Italy surrendered earlier, Germany in May 45.
Yeah.
Did that add to the pressure on Japan?
Absolutely. It left Japan totally isolated among the major Axis powers. The government at the time, the Suzuki Kuntaro cabinet, was actually trying to find a way out.
Oh.
They were hoping the Soviet Union, which was still officially neutral with Japan, might mediate some kind of peace deal.
But wasn't there a secret agreement involving the Soviets?
There was. The Yalta Agreement, February 45. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. The Soviets had secretly agreed to enter the war against Japan soon after Germany was defeated.
So Japan's hopes for Soviet help well, they were never going to happen.
Basically, no.
Yeah.
And the price for Soviet entry. They wanted territories back that they'd lost to Japan decades earlier, plus the Kuril Islands north of Hokkaido.
Okay, so that avenue was closed. Then came the Potsdam Declaration in July 45.
Right. U.S., U.K., China, the Soviets joined later, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender, laying out the terms.
How did Japan react?
Officially, they use the word mokusatsu. It's a bit ambiguous, could mean treat with silent contempt or withhold comment, but the Allies took it as a rejection. Japan was still hoping, perhaps, for that Soviet mediation that wasn't coming.
And then the atomic bombs. Hiroshima, August 6th. Nagasaki, August 9th.
Just world-changing, devastating events. The scale of immediate death and destruction was immense, maybe 200,000 in Hiroshima, over 70,000 in Nagasaki, just from the initial blasts and firestorms.
And the long-term effects, the radiation sickness.
Exactly. Suffering that continued for years, for decades. We have that image of the A-bomb dome in Hiroshima. A really powerful, haunting reminder.
And right between the two bombings.
The Soviets declared war August 8th. They violated the Neutrality Pact and invaded Manchuria, the Kuril Islands, just as they'd agreed at Yalta.
So, conventional bombing, atomic bombs, the Soviets attacking.
Yeah.
The pressure was overwhelming.
Completely untenable. But even then, accepting surrender wasn't straightforward within the Japanese government.
There was resistance from the
It's
military.
deep resistance. They were arguing about the terms, about preserving the emperor's system. It took an unprecedented step.
The emperor's intervention.
Emperor Showa himself intervened in the deadlocked government meetings, expressed his wish to end the war and accept the Potsdam Declaration. That was the deciding factor.
When did they finally accept?
They notified the Allies on August 14th, and then, the next day, August 15th, the emperor's voice was broadcast on the radio, announcing the surrender to the nation. For most people, it was the first time they'd ever heard his voice.
A truly profound moment. And the formal signing.
That happened on September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, General Imizu for Japan, General MacArthur for the Allies, representatives from other allied nations. That officially ended it all.
3 years, 8 months of the Pacific War. And the cost.
Staggering. Around 3 million Japanese military and civilian deaths are missing during World War II. Maybe close to 9 million people affected overall if you count wounded, displaced.
And even after the surrender, the suffering wasn't over for everyone.
No. Around 600,000 Japanese soldiers who surrendered to the Soviets were sent to Siberia and Mongolia, forced labor camps, and estimated 60,000 died there in captivity.
Just an immense tragedy from start to finish. So recapping quickly. Early success, then the tide turns at Midway, Allied pushback, Saipan falls, huge strain at home, mobilization, shortages.
Right, propaganda versus reality. Then the devastating final phase. Heavy bombing, Okinawa, the atomic bomb, Soviet entry, all converging.
which finally forced the surrender despite internal resistance, thanks to the emperor's intervention.
That sums it up pretty well. A complex web of military defeats, domestic hardship, and those final decisive shocks.
It really underscores how these events didn't just end a war, they fundamentally reshaped Japan and its place in the world. Thinking about all this, what do you think are the lasting lessons, maybe for Japan, maybe for everyone, looking back at this period? It's something to really ponder, isn't it?